Hi, my name is Jake Vossenkemper, Director of Agronomy here at Liqui-Grow, and today we have a very special guest with us, Scott Tinsman. If you've watched some of these videos in the past, you know that Scott is one of the owners of Liqui-Grow. And if you're watching this video, this is a prequel to our upcoming Lead Academy session on fungicide for corn and soybean.
Jake, thank you. Obviously, each year we go into a crop praying that our farmers have a profitable, solid crop, but we also know the role Mother Nature plays. When we started putting together the webinar a few weeks ago, the crop was in a good condition and we had rain forecast in certain areas. 3 weeks later, we know some areas are droughty, some areas did get the rain. So as you watch this webinar, please keep in mind what your local conditions are out on the farm. You know, some of the information may be applicable and appropriate. Some you may say, hey, we're probably better off waiting a year. But in either case, look at it as an educational opportunity such that you can make better decisions on your farm.
Absolutely, Scott. And I might just add that, you know, go in a little more detail what Scott said, he's absolutely right. We have some locations, I get around to a lot of our geography, we have some locations that look fantastic. We've got rains, you know, that Traer, Iowa City area, looking really good. By no means should you change your plans for applying fungicide on corn or soybean in those geographies that I'm speaking of. Obviously behind us, we have some corn that's pretty drought stricken, but in the background, in this same field, there's some corn that's holding in there very well, given the lack of water that this specific field has received. So I don't think it's time to change plans per se yet, but do know that if by tasseling we haven't had some good rains in your geography, a fungicide is not going to fix that corn, and that's really the point.
So thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to look at this summer's webinar on fungicide. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Jake Vossenkemper, Director of Agronomy and Research here at Liqui-Grow. Welcome to our 2023 Summer Lead Academy session. Today we have a very special guest with me, Kurt Maertens. Kurt is the Technical Services Representative for Eastern Iowa and Northwest Illinois. Kurt and I have known each other for, going on 4, 5, 6 years now. So Kurt and I have had a good professional relationship, and we are looking forward to having a discussion today about fungicide, the upcoming fungicide season, what we might expect, what we might see, and kind of give everybody some reminders on what these diseases might look like and what may or may not impact us in 2023. So before we get into all that, I'm going to give a little weather update. I am not a meteorologist by any means, or a climatologist, but I've been watching the weather closely, and I've been watching very closely what the climatologists are saying. And obviously, we have been dry. We are currently in the lowest level of drought on the drought monitor for the entire eastern part of Iowa and Northwest Illinois. That will be updated this morning, and we may go into the next level of drought. I'm not sure, but we need some rain is the bottom line. Okay. Now the good news is I've watched a couple different presentations by some climatologists last night, and the good news is that they actually expect that we should enter a wetter period as we go forward here. So right now we're in what they call there's El Niño and La Niña, and right now we're in a INSO neutral phase, they call it, which means we're neither in a El Niño or a La Niña. But the La Niña period is generally the wetter period, okay? And the climatologists say we are transitioning into the La Niña period as we speak. So in other words, they are seeing the ocean temperatures in the Pacific rising as we speak, and they expect by the end of June, July, that we'll be officially in a La Niña period. And because of that, because of the warmer ocean temperatures, that will force more moisture into the atmosphere. The prevailing winds will blow that moisture into the Midwest, and we should start to see some greater chances of precipitation. In fact, the NOAA 3-month outlook calls for a 30 to 40% chance of wetter than normal weather across eastern Iowa and into Northwest Illinois. And I hope that happens, Kurt.
Right. Yeah.
We need that.
Yeah, this thing could change at any time. I've seen the same forecasts And we just need to be prepared for that type of weather when it gets here. We could definitely use it. Hopefully it gets here sooner than later. But again, I mean, that's why we're here, and that's why we're talking about this, because people are asking those questions. You know, what do we do? How do we prepare when that weather does change for us?
Yeah. And you know, Kurt, I know you know this, we were just talking about this, it's the weather forecast, right? I mean, no one knows, but the only other thing we can do is do this and guess, right? And that's, you know, that's what we got, right? So the climatologists are predicting we're gonna enter a wetter period, and to your point, we want to be prepared.
Yep. Jake, a lot of questions I get this time of year about fungicides is what diseases should I be looking for? And so I just want to review our most common corn diseases first. Always gray leaf spot.
Yeah, absolutely, Kurt. And you know, most farmers and ag retail salesmen kind of know these diseases off the cuff, but it's been a year.
Yeah, right.
Since
right.
It's been a year since we thought about it, so it wouldn't hurt to review that. I agree.
Right. Our common diseases in corn here in eastern Iowa and in western Illinois would be gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, our rust species, common and potentially southern, and the big whammy is tar spot. I mean, that's the one that's been in the media the most. It's the one that we've seen them do the most damage here recently. So we've got several different diseases that we have to contend with, and all reasons why we use a fungicide. So let me explain the difference between the diseases. Obviously, we think about our disease triangle. So we've got our pathogen, we've got our host, which is the corn, and we've got to have the environment to get them all going. And so when we put those together, that's when we're going to have our diseases develop. Usually that's a period of wetness from multiple rainfall events, even heavy dews, things like that. Generally, precipitation, wetness is a key to getting all this going. From there, it just kind of depends on the temperatures, and that's going to dictate what, if we see more gray leaf spot or maybe northern corn leaf blight. From what we're seeing with tar spot, temperature doesn't seem to matter as much because it develops when it's cold or hot. But first off, we'll start talking about gray leaf spot. It's going to be a longer rectangular lesion, pretty easy to distinguish, especially if you compare it to northern corn leaf blight. It's going to be more of a long cigar-shaped lesion, although some hybrids handle it a little bit differently, so it may not be as large or as we think. It might be a smaller lesion. And then tar spot, I think most of us are familiar with it here, but as we go farther west, it may be a newer disease to those folks. And so tar spot is just like the disease says. It literally looks like someone, like you dipped your hand into a bucket of tar and you literally just flick that tar onto the leaf surface, and it leaves these little raised spots, and that's your lesion, and it literally just looks like tar on the leaf.
Yeah, and that's exactly, literally, to your point, what it looks like.
Yeah.
It looks like you stuck your hand in a bucket of paint and flipped it on the leaves.
Yeah. Very hard to see at first, because usually those first few tar spot lesions are very, very small, and they're very infrequent. And then after that, as the disease progresses and really gets rolling, the spores get flying and it can take off, and then you'll see lots and lots and lots of the lesions, and by the end of the season, you can have the plant completely covered in them.
And Kurt, to your point, it is amazing how fast it can go from a few lesions to a whole bunch.
Right.
I mean, since we've been dealing with tar spot for the last 4 or 5 years, I've had lots of conversations with farmers and our retail salesmen, and I'm always talking about be on the lookout for tar spot. They'll go out and look, Jake, we don't have any tar spot, and they'll go back and look in a week, and holy smokes, did it change. It's kind of mind-blowing how rapid it can change.
Yeah, and that's why we're talking about being prepared. When we do get a weather change, or we do start getting that rain, we've got the inoculant here. So those diseases that I already talked about, gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, tar spot, all those spores overwinter in our residue from last year, and then when we get the right weather conditions, then they're going to splash up onto our leaves and get that infection process started. And so having that plan in place is huge, because again, it can happen so fast, we need to be prepared for it.
Kurt, you had mentioned, western, how far has tar spot moved to the west?
I think folks in the eastern third of Iowa, most of the eastern third of Iowa, have dealt with it in an economic situation where it's been detrimental to yields. I'm pretty sure everyone across the state of Iowa has at least seen it late, like at harvest, where it's really not doing much. But when you see it late like that, that means you now have the inoculant, like I've already talked about. It's in the residue, and again, we're just waiting for the right conditions to really get that thing up and going.
I've been getting more photos from our northeast Iowa location, or our north central Iowa locations, more photos in the fall what's this? What's this? What's this? And it's been tar spot.
Yep.
So they have the inoculum. And to your point, it's been late in the fall where they're seeing
Right.
it.
Usually about 2 to 3 years of seeing that. You really need to be on the watch out, because again, if you get those right weather conditions, it'll really hit you good, because you've got that buildup of inoculant. Now, the other disease, I mentioned the rust species.
Yes. Yeah.
And a lot of times tar spot can be confused with rust, especially early on. And now, rust species, so common and southern, those do not overwinter here. They overwinter in the south and usually blow up on us. We generally see some common rust every year. That one's pretty common.
Pretty common. Yep.
Southern rust is an occasional pest, but when it does show up, it can be bad. And again, since the rust pustules for both common and southern rust are small, can be confused with tar spot. But tar spot's always going to be a kind of a deep brown to almost black, versus our rust species
literally orange to red.
Orange to red, right, and do have a little bit difference in their lesion.
Mm-hmm. So you brought up rust, and like you said, Kurt, I see common rust every single year. And I think it's important to talk a little bit about the two rust species here for a minute. We have common rust, as we've talked about a little bit here. Typically, it doesn't get very severe. Typically, it's a raised lesion that has kind of a dark red color to it. Usually, the lesions are there might be 3 or 4 in a given area. But southern rust is much less frequent, but much more serious when you get it. And typically, southern rust gets blown up on thunderstorms or hurricanes, and that's when we tend to get it real bad. And I mean, I see it somewhere almost every year, right? But if it gets here early enough, that's the big concern. And so southern rust is going to be more of a light red to an orange, and it's going to have a lot of powder associated with it. If you can knock the leaf off and you can see little orange powder, rust pustules on your hand, that's southern rust.
Yep.
So, if a farmer or a retail salesman is confused at all when you see this in the field, don't hesitate to contact me, because if it's southern rust, it probably needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, it's a very aggressive species.
Yes,
Yep.
yes. And common rust, probably not so much.
Right.
So it is important to be able to identify those appropriately, and it might not hurt ag retail salesmen to kind of look through your different textbooks and kind of brush up on how to differentiate common and southern rust, because if we do get southern rust, while infrequent, it can be very problematic and does need to be dealt with.
Just like tar spot, actually all these fungal diseases that we're talking about here today, Jake, we want to have our fungicide application before these diseases really start going on these plants. And so that's another common question that I get a lot, is when should I make our fungicide application? So say I've got Veltima, that's what I want to use. What's the best time to apply? Well, I'm going to say make sure it's before onset of disease. But generally that's going to be VTR1 on corn. So right when we start getting our tassels out, that's generally the best time, because we're going to be in front of most of our disease infection. Sometimes we might have to go a little bit earlier than that. We've seen tar spot come in early like that. Farther south, they've seen southern rust come in before tassel. So again, it's about being in front of the disease. But again, generally, that VTR1 is kind of the sweet spot.
All right, Kurt, so you brought up timing, okay? You brought up timing in corn. I get a boatload of questions every year about, Jake, we applied our fungicide at VT last year, and we had a whole bunch of tar spot at the end of the year, or we had a whole bunch of gray leaf spot at the end of the year. I think I'm going to wait this year. And I understand why you would want to do that, but I also don't think we can outguess the diseases. Could you kind of address that question a little bit?
Yeah,
they've heard my soapbox on this. Can they hear your soapbox?
Right, yeah. We can't outguess these diseases, and that's because of the latent period. And the latent period is the time between infection and when we see the lesions show up. And it's different with different species. Gray leaf spot's probably 7 to 10 days. Northern corn leaf blights probably like 2 weeks. Tar spot, we're still trying to figure out. We think it's 2 weeks, but sometimes it could be as long as a month. Either way, if we really don't know when we've got that infection taking place. So again, like I mentioned earlier, we want to be in front of that infection if we can, because that's when we're going to be most effective at controlling our diseases with a fungicide. Now, with that being said, timing-wise, we may have to go a little bit earlier than that optimal timing of VTR1. Sometimes we can go a little bit later. Something that's a recent development is 2 applications of
I want to
fungicide.
talk about that today because I get a lot of questions about
Right,
that, particularly
right.
with the tar spot we've had in the last several years.
Which is crazy because I've spent the last decade trying to sell fungicide or at one pass at VT has always been a struggle. Now we're talking about 2 passes.
Right.
But with tar spot, we've seen that has been a viable option for treatment if you have enough disease pressure. So let's talk about that just for a second. Again, 1 pass or 1 application at BTR1 of fungicides, 99% of the time is going to do everything we need it to do. So that's the good news. If we do happen to get into one of those years where we've got just a tremendous amount of disease pressure from tar spot or southern rust, those are 2 aggressive diseases that we could see here in our area. Yes, maybe that first application goes out at VTR1 or maybe slightly before that. And then the general recommendation from us is another application 3 weeks later.
Okay, so VTR1 and then 3 weeks later.
Yeah,
if you're going to do 2 passes.
Yeah, it gets you to about our 3. So say your first application is at VTR1's mid-July. 3 weeks later, you're now into the first week of August. That second application is going to give you enough residual to basically get the black layer, which is generally going to be somewhere in early September.
So Kurt, I'm sure people can just immediately see this already without me saying it, but just to say it, where I've seen tar spot really bad, even in a dry year, is under irrigation. So would you say, I'm asking your professional opinion, would you say that if you have irrigation in eastern Iowa or northwest Illinois that you ought to plan to make 2 passes for tar spot or not?
Fields with heavy disease pressure would be irrigated fields.
Yep.
High fertility fields, corn on corn fields. These are all environments that are going to have a lot of disease pressure, a lot of inoculant there, or have the right environment to get the disease going, especially irrigation.
Yep.
We talked about that moisture is one of the drivers for developing these diseases. So yes, in the world of tar spot, if we're talking about that disease specifically, those irrigated fields probably should plan on 2 applications. Yep. You may not need it depending on the weather, but that's probably a good idea at this point in the game.
With product availability and the issues we've had with that historically, if you have irrigation, I would probably be prepared to make 2 at minimum.
Yep. I think it's a common theme that you're all hearing from us is we need to be prepared to make these fungicide applications because of these newer diseases that are finding our crops susceptible, which they are, all corn's susceptible, to something like tar spot. And so a lot of bushels can be lost very fast if we are not prepared.
Yeah, and Kurt, the other thing that I've seen literally happen over the last couple of years is, yes, we're dry. I'm sure there's some folks that are thinking about, do I need it this year? What scares me a little bit is if we do get wet, like they're predicting, and I, again, hope that's true, if you give up your product or you get off of the list and we do get wet, when are you going to be able to get back on it? Because I have seen literally people make decisions at the last minute to go ahead and apply because of tar spot, and they couldn't get a plan for 3 weeks. And that ends up being a bad day. So again, I think preparedness is important.
Yeah, definitely. When we get in these years where we have a big disease run, more acres get treated than normal, doesn't mean that we have more planes available or more sprayers available. That's a set number of application equipment there, and they can only cover so many acres on the days where it's not raining and things like that. So again, it's about being prepared, having that plan in place. If we see the right conditions, again, those fields with the right environments, the right potential, we need to have them on the list and get that application done in a timely fashion.
All right, Kurt, corn is king. We've talked a lot about corn, but we can't forget about soybeans, which are also very important to us here in the Midwest. Let's talk about diseases and fungicide management in soybeans. So why don't you talk about some of the common diseases we might see in soybean or expect to see here in eastern Iowa and northwest Illinois?
You bet. Our most common diseases that we're going to see in soybeans would be septoria. That's what I call a yield nibbler. It usually starts at the lower canopy and works its way up. It's, again, not a hammer type of disease, but it's going to sit there and nibble at our yield potential. And when we're trying to raise 80+ bushel beans, we don't want anything nibbling at that yield potential. So that's the main disease that we're going after. Other places we're going to see frog eye leaf spot, which is worrisome because we are seeing some resistance to the strobies in that disease, and if that does come in, produces a larger lesion that can have a lot of detrimental effect to soybeans.
Yeah, Kurt, it's kind of like southern rust almost in corn. I mean, it's definitely not an every year deal. It's probably more frequent than southern rust, frankly. But when we get it, it can hammer yield.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah, and it's overwintering, just like the corn diseases that we've talked about. It's in last year's residue.
Yep.
Same as Septoria. And so once you get it and you've got that inoculant there, we get the right weather, and boom, we can have that disease show up on the beans. You know, we've talked a lot about some other diseases. It feels like we're starting to see more and more, which would be later developing diseases like Sescospora or Phomopsis, which tends to be in the later part of pod fill when it comes into plants, and you know, Sescospora can create like a purple seed stain,
yep,
which could get you a dock in the field. And Phomopsis is, you know, it's really going to affect the pods and development of that late pod fill. And again, those are diseases that we can target with like an R3 application of fungicide.
And Phomopsis is one that's not well understood, and we tend to get it when we have, you know, some frequent rain events in August. And believe it or not, I get a lot of phone calls about, you know, what are all these little dots on my pods, and what are all these little dots on my stems, and I get a lot of that. So, you know, I've started to judge the problems based on the number of phone calls I get. And over the last few years, I have gotten several phone calls, a lot of phone calls about what's wrong with my beans at harvest. Why are my beans black? You know, it's usually either anthracnose or it's Phomopsis. So it is one that can be a concern.
Yeah. Jake, I think what growers are starting to see, they're starting to pay attention more to these diseases, because we are learning how to grow good soybeans now.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of your customers are growing 80+ bushel beans. And once we start getting to that yield level, all these diseases, which didn't seem to affect our beans a whole lot at a lower yield level, are starting to rob some significant bushels from us. And that's making that fungicide application a lot more important.
And so to that point, Kurt, I just want to take a minute and talk about a study I did back in 2020. So what we did is we had a set of plots that we called normal management, and a set of plots that we called kind of our high yield management. And I'm not going to go through all the factors and the treatments, but this was averaged over 3 sites in 2020, and they were replicated at least six times per site, if not more. But the point I'm trying to make is this nice, good data set. We had a 5.5 bushel yield increase with a fungicide and insecticide applied at R3 in soybean in the normal management category. And we had an 8.1 bushel yield increase in the high yield management category. So that just kind of really brings home your point. You know, when you have high soybean yield potentials, you need to protect the canopy, you need to be able to finish out filling the seeds. It becomes really important.
Yeah, that's something we're seeing time and time again as we're raising our soybean yield levels with better management practices, better fertility, better genetics, better weed control. Again, we got to make sure that we're combating those diseases and insects.
Yes.
Because they play an important role. Because there is that benefit. Always put an insecticide with your fungicide at that R3 timing.
Absolutely. And on that note, I strongly believe that stink bug are a bigger problem than most farmers think. But on that same vein, I'm seeing a lot of stink bugs in corn that had cereal rye planted before the corn. And I'm seeing more stink bugs in soybean fields where cereal rye was planted before soybean. And, you know, cover crops are becoming more common. So I think in general, before cover crops, stink bugs are a problem. And I'm thinking that the cover crops is aggravating that problem. So stink bugs are a problem. And I think they need to be controlled. And yes, insects can be problematic. You know, I think about stink bugs and bean leaf beetle. You know, those are the two that I worry about in soybean.
Yep. Again, past that we might not have paid attention to, but again, at higher yield levels, those stink bugs and bean leaf beetles are getting into the pods, and it doesn't take a whole lot of pods drop to start reducing our soybean yield.
Not to mention bean leaf beetles vector bean pod monovirus.
Exactly.
And I also think that's a hidden yield robber. And that's that same video where I talk about stink bugs, I talk about bean pod monovirus and what the problem is with that. And if you want to know more about that, please check out that link.
we did come off of a pretty mild winter, and so generally that's going to tell us we should be on the watch out for more insect pests because they had a better chance to survive the winter.
Yep.
So, things that we might not have seen for a long time, like soybean aphids or spider mites, things like that.
Well,
we need to be paying attention to our fields, and again, those insect pests can rob a lot of yield from our fields really fast if we're not paying attention.
All right, Kurt, so we've talked about some of the common diseases in soybean, and now, I have to be honest with you, I'm a pretty big fan of a fungicide and insecticide application in soybean. So I say that because I've done enough of my own research, I've seen enough of my own plots, I have seen what some of the university data is saying, and I'm going to reference a specific study here in a minute. And I've talked to a lot of really good farmers that have really tested the idea of fungicide and insecticides in a good way, in a way that they can really know, and they believe that it's profitable, and I believe that it's profitable. Yes, there's years where it won't be, but over a 10-year period, I am almost 100% certain that that is a profitable production practice, okay? In addition to that, I'm going to reference one of these university studies. So in 2015 and 16, Purdue headed up a study. There were a bunch of universities involved across the upper Midwest, but Purdue headed it up. And what they did is they ended up collecting, I think it was 3,200 something. They ended up asking farmers, and this is over 3,200 fields in the upper Midwest. They sent out a survey. They said, what are your production practices? And please report your yield. And it was verified yield data that they collected. And when they summarized all this information, what they did is they kind of ranked about 20 different management practices. And fungicide and insecticide on soybean, if I recall, was like 4 or 5, okay? And they reported on average I believe it was a 4.6 bushel yield increase to a fungicide and insecticide application on soybean. And I have summarized a bunch of data from my own work, and it's about 4.1, so that's right in line with some of my own work. I just believe that it's a profitable practice. What's some of the BASF information say?
A lot of our data is real similar to that. If we think about the fungicide market where it is today, we're still in its infancy. You got to think products like Headline were first introduced in 2004, so we're not even 20 years from that.
Right.
And we've seen a lot of really great new active ingredients and different modes of actions come into the marketplace. And each time a new active ingredient comes along or a new site of action, mode of action, it just brings the consistency level, the consistency that we see a positive yield response that much higher. So, BASF's newest product like Revitec, it's 3 modes of action with our newest molecule. 93% of the time we see a positive response, and that's bringing about 5 bushels. So real close to the data that you've mentioned. Even our other top brand in soybeans, Preaxor, is about 92% of the time, and it's about 4.8 bushel yield response over the average of hundreds and hundreds of on-farmed and replicated trials. So, I mean, it's just that consistency, and I think a lot of folks that maybe tried a fungicide, but way back then, it was one mode of action, so maybe you didn't see that response. Things have changed, and along with our management practices, our yield potential is so much higher. We've got these new, more powerful fungicides. We're getting better response out of them, and they are definitely very profitable applications.
Yeah, good. Okay, so it sounds like both you and I are big fans of fungicide, insecticide on soybean. So if we're going to spray a lot of acres and we're going to do it often, we also have to start worrying about resistance management. Could you talk a little bit about the frog eye leaf spot resistance and Septoria brown spot resistance, and what do we do about it?
Jake, I think what you're referencing is the strobilurin-resistant frog eye leaf spot in Septoria. So in certain pockets across the Midwest, we do see those diseases resistant to that mode of action of fungicide. The good news is most of our fungicides that we use today are premixes that have other modes of action, and that's the best way to combat the development of resistance to our fungicides with these diseases. So again, the other modes of action that we use would be the DMIs and the SDHIs along with the strobies. And again, like I mentioned, a lot of the products that we use today are combinations of all three, or have one of the other ones in with the strobies.
So Kurt, kind of on that note, you know, there's now a broad range of fungicide active ingredients and number of modes of action on the market. You know, and there's always kind of, you know, it depends, but sometimes it can be attractive to use the cheap fungicide, okay? And my concern with that is, you know, it's not always the case, but in a lot of cases, that fungicide might only have one mode of action, right?
Yep.
And so, if you do have strobilurin resistant frog eye leaf spot or trizol resistant brown spot, that's not going to get the job done. So you need to be using a product with multiple modes of action. And again, I can point you to several different university publications that show that exact thing. It's about multiple modes of action, no different than it is for controlling weeds.
Exactly.
So
you want to utilize all the modes, and that's the best way to defeat resistance.
Yep.
I know it seems opposite,
and to get good control.
Yeah, that seems opposite of what we're thinking, but we've shown that in weeds as well. If we rely on just one single mode of action, right, we're going to develop resistance to that faster than if we utilize basically all the tools available to us.
Yep, absolutely. So Kurt, we've covered a lot of stuff here today, but I do want to mention application timing in soybean, okay? And I get a lot of questions on this, and if you know me, you already know my soapbox on this. So please give me your opinion, and make it your own opinion, about what's the best time to apply fungicide, insecticide on soybean.
My recommendation is always going to be to try to time that fungicide and insecticide application at R3. And the definition of an R3 soybean plant is when you have one pod 3/16 of an inch long and one of the top 4 uppermost nodes. I see a lot of people try to make the mistake of making the fungicide insecticide application maybe too early. Again, depending on when disease or insect pressure comes in, you can. I mean, the general window is R2 to R4. You know, we say R3. That's I think if you plan an R2 application, the other thing is identifying or correctly staging soybeans as well.
Which can be a challenge.
It can be a challenge because there can be a long time between R2 and R3. If you think the true definition of an R2 soybean plant, there could only be, I don't know, 9, 10 nodes on a plant. And when we make a fungicide and insecticide application, it only protects the leaves that are out there, whether it's corn or soybeans or alfalfa or whatever. And so we know a soybean plant can have 22, 24 nodes. So if we apply at R2 and we only have 10 nodes, we have over half of our nodes yet to come out and could be protected or need to be protected later on in the season. If we wait till true R3, generally we've got 16 nodes, give or take, somewhere in there. Yes, there's a few more to come out, but we've protected the majority of the plants, and the main nodes, your main yield producing nodes, come from that middle 50% of the nodes.
About that R3 period. Actually.
About that R3 period is when your main yield producing nodes are out there. And those are the ones we really want to protect, obviously.
And I'll also say, Kurt, I have no doubt that there's some folks getting out there too early, but I also know there's some folks getting out there too late. And I think it has to do with we're very focused on corn fungicide application. We're very operationally driven and focused on that. And when I'm at a location, I might have one of our salesmen say, hey, Jake, would you go look at that field? Would you kind of remind me what R3 looks like? And that's great. I encourage you to do that. We get out there and heck, it's R4, or even later, right? So you really, in my opinion, need to do the best job you can targeting that R3 period, because it's difficult to understand what's R2, what's R4. So farmers and ag retail salesmen, brush up on your soybean growth stage. It's important to hit that R3. We might put a recent data set from Iowa State in the background showing the yield increase from various soybean application timings. And that data set will make it very clear what the best timing is, and that's R3. All right, we're gonna wrap this up, Kurt. I think we've jabbered long enough. I hope the customers and our ag retail salespeople found this valuable. Thank you very much, Kurt, for taking time out of your day. I know you're a busy fella. Appreciate you coming down and doing this. Lastly, please, if you like this video, we make some much shorter videos throughout the growing season, highlighting different agronomic topics of interest. They're usually 2 to 3 to 4 minutes long. If you like this and you want something shorter, that would be excellent. You can basically sign up for that. It's called our Liqui-Grow Loop and get it via text message. And with that, please like and subscribe. I'm not going to ask you to pay for this on Patreon or whatever it is, but please do like and subscribe. Thank you very much. And Kurt, lastly, let's pray for rain.
That's right.
The plots need rain, the farmers' fields need rain, we need rain.
That's right. That's right.
Lead Academy.
Liqui-Grow
Excellence
And agronomy
development.